I'm joined by Graham Bash, who's from the Jewish Voice for Labour. Do you accept, first of all, as Jeremy Corbyn does, that there are pockets of anti-Semitism in the party, and also that Jeremy Corbyn has been left wanting on this issue?
I certainly do not accept that Jeremy's been left wanting at all. I know what anti-Semitism is. I've experienced it all my life, especially when I was young. And I've been in the Labour Party for 50 years. And to me, the party's always been a safe haven from anti-Semitism, a safe place for me to be a Jew. So pockets, very small pockets indeed. I've been a party member all this time in 8 different constituency parties, and once in 50 years have I ever witnessed an incident of anti-Semitism.
One Labour MP has said that Labour always stood for the dispossessed, those without a voice, and it's not doing that now, but also that this could destroy the party. What do you think about that?
I think it could, and I think that the people who are putting out these smears are those who are trying to undermine the Labour leadership and the party in the run-up to the elections. And what they're doing is this: it's a combination of the right wing of the party who want to undermine Jeremy and the pro-Israel lobby who conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, and it's a cruel deception.
If this was just about a smear, then why would Jeremy Corbyn put out a statement apologising for anti-Semitism in the party, saying yes, there are small pockets of anti-Semitism in the party? Both those groups who have signed this statement say it's nothing to do with a smear campaign. They just want this issue sorted out.
2 things to say that. Firstly, Jeremy has many qualities, and one of them is generosity to those who are his political opponents. I think he's being over-generous. Small pockets, perhaps very small pockets indeed. The point about anti-Semitism is that it's underrepresented in the Labour Party, and I would remind you and people looking in today that the victims of these allegations are mainly either Jewish activists themselves, a number of those people criticised are themselves Jews, or black activists and anti-racist activists. So it's a nonsense. All of us Jews who are being criticised for anti-Semitism, what's this about? It's a lie.
This week I'm delighted to welcome Graham Bash. Graham, are you speaking from London?
I'm speaking from the Kent coast, Broadstairs, which is where I live.
Graham is a veteran of the Labour Party. He remained in the Labour Party under a war criminal leader like Tony Blair. He's very active in fighting for free speech inside the Labour Party, and he's political officer of, what's the organisation again, Graham?
Jewish Voice for Labour.
Jewish Voice for Labour, of course, JVL. So he's the political officer for that organisation, which has been fighting hard against those who would seek to criminalise discussions on Israel and Palestine. So, Graham, welcome.
Nice to be here.
Why did you found Jewish Voice for Labour?
Well, I didn't fight. I was not.
No, I don't mean you. I mean you collectively.
But it was set up some 2.5 years ago because we needed to show that there was an alternative voice for the Jewish so-called community. The point, of course, is that there is not one Jewish community. There is not one Jewish voice, but hundreds and thousands of Jewish voices. And there is an honourable socialist, internationalist, universalist tradition within Jewish history. And we wanted to make that live so that it wasn't just the voice of the Jewish establishment and of the Zionists that was heard. And that's why we set up this organisation, which I think has proved its value in the last 2 years. And I always say to people, imagine what life would have been like in the Labour Party if there wasn't that alternative Jewish socialist voice.
I have to say that in Scotland for many years we had very strong claims by leaders of the so-called leaders of the Jewish community who would say things like, during the last massacre in Gaza, when the Glasgow City Council flew a Palestinian flag for all of 24 hours, they started to say that Jews were terrified and were thinking of leaving Scotland because of that. And we did not have at that time an effective countervailing voice to say, these rascals don't speak for a unified Jewish community. So we've suffered under that. But what sort of difference do you think JVL has made?
Well, I think we've been a thorn in the side of those who want to present the Jewish voice as a single establishment Zionist voice. The difference we've made, I think, can be shown at the Labour Party conference before last, where we contributed in unity with others to a resolution, however limited, that established the issue of Palestine firmly on Labour's agenda. And I think that we have challenged the prevailing view, not successfully, let's be clear, we've a long way to go, but we've at least started the process. But let me say this, that I got something wrong until recently. I used to say that this witch hunt against those who speak out for Palestine and those who challenge the definition of anti-Semitism, connecting it with Zionism. I used to say this witch hunt wouldn't stop until they had got the person they were after, Jeremy Corbyn. But of course I underestimated this. They've got Jeremy Corbyn, but the witch hunt is continuing. And I now think that the establishment voices will not stop this witch hunt unless and until they've got rid of every socialist in the Labour Party. So I've underestimated it. Quite clearly, it's going on and on and on. And the role of the JVL is not, as we anticipated, going to be less after the election. Unfortunately, we're on the front line and it's going to be more. And just something that's happened in the last few hours. Our secretary, JVL secretary, Glyn Secker, was due to speak tomorrow, I think it was, on a Holocaust memorial meeting in Tower Hamlets. Firstly, as anticipated, the Labour Council in Tower Hamlets stopped the venue. They wouldn't allow the meeting to take place. No matter, it looks bad for the Labour Party, but no matter, another venue was found. But worse, this morning, Glyn was told by Stand Up to Racism, who had organised this meeting, that he would not be allowed to speak. And I think that it's the real problem isn't when the Jewish establishment, the Jewish leadership, or the Zionists, often, but not always the same thing, the problem isn't just them, because they can say what they like. The real problem is that when people who are supposed to be on our side concede to this, retreat to it, on the basis that let's not cause trouble, let's draw a line in the sand, and if we only retreat on this, the problem will go away. Well, what a self-defeating strategy that is. The more we concede, the more this witch hunt will go on, the more our political enemies will be emboldened. And when we've seen it with Hope Not Hate, who have played a disgraceful role in supporting the witch hunt, and now when even those who are clearly on the left, just to Stand Up to Racism, collude with this kind of thing, we know we've got problems. And their argument was quite simply, we don't want to fight with the Board of Deputies. I mean, why not? Why not have a political fight with those who we think are misleading sections of the Jewish community? They are not the Jewish community. They represent at most 25% of the Jewish community. There are so many alternative voices, and to collude with this is very, very dangerous indeed. And I think this kind of thing has led us into many of the problems we are facing today.
You've got an active computer, that's absolutely fine.
I'm sorry about that. I can't stop it. Stop that, I'll stop you.
I'm glad you've still got friends. So obviously you didn't win, but it's always better to fight than not to fight. Many of us are involved in campaigns where we find that more often than not, we cannot say that we won, but at least we put up a fight. What was Glyn going to say about the Holocaust that was intolerable to the local council and intolerable to anyone else? Is he the wrong kind of Jew?
He's the wrong kind of Jew. The simple answer, of course, is that anything he would have said, and I am not privy to what speech he had prepared, would have said nothing that any reasonable socialist Jewish internationalist could have objected to. What he may have said was something to the effect, and this is what's put him in difficulties before, but there are some Zionists who have some links with far-right organisations, and that it is necessary for those who claim to speak for the Jewish people to condemn those forces that line up with the far right. And if people don't like that message, then let's have the debate. No, sometimes, you know, we can say something, it may not quite be right, and we can learn by having a debate. But the thing I've learned is this: if you shut down debate, then you end up burning books, and all reasonable discussion is shut down. We learned that, by the way, with people like Ken Livingstone. Now, I don't agree with everything that Ken said on everything, and even on the thing about the Havara agreement, perhaps his formulations were not what I would have said.
A little bit
but
clumsy.
nonetheless, he referred to something of crucial historical significance.
Yeah.
And to shut down that debate, I mean, if we carry on like this, then we will burn the books of Ilan Pappé with his ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. We will not be allowed to discuss our history. And if we close down, if Jewish people are not, like me and others, are not allowed to discuss our own history, it impacts not only on us, but those other peoples we have touched in one way or the other. And it will end up, of course, shutting down Palestinian voices as well.
Can I come to that? Can I come to that, Graham? Because we can talk about censorship, and we wish to. You and I might wish to discuss 1,000 different topics, and they could be declared out of bounds, which is terrible. But there's something particularly sinister about a group not being allowed to tell its own story. So you might wish to talk about internationalism, those Jews who fought alongside many, many others in the labour movement against anti-Semitism in the past. But surely the current witch hunt also prevents Palestinians talking about what happened to them, that they are the victims of an ethnic cleansing operation, that from their point of view, and from mine as well, but from their point of view, the state that cleansed them is an ethnic cleansing state, is a racist state. But apparently saying that is anti-Semitic, is it not, Corbyn?
That is what is claimed, and I feel this very deeply. Let me just briefly go through my history. I'm Jewish, and I've been a Labour Party member for 51 years, and I've gone through the Blair years, so I can stand what's happening now. This is nothing. But let me say that I came into the Labour Party and the Labour movement partly because of my experience as a young Jewish boy of anti-Semitism. I mean, I was told at school that Hitler should have finished the job, that you Jews killed our Jesus. And for my sins, I'm a West Ham fan, and I've had to walk out of football grounds when West Ham fans have been singing, "I've never felt more like gutting the Jews." Now, this is sinister stuff. And there is a problem with anti-Semitism throughout sections of Europe, and it's probably on the rise. I've no doubt about that, actually. But the danger is from the fascist far right, as it's always been. And what's happening is two things: that the real anti-Semitism is going under the radar, and just as significantly, the real racism in this country, institutional racism against black people and against Muslims, is also going under the radar, with all this nonsense about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Now, let me make it clear, for the avoidance of doubt, for those who want to expel me for saying this, I am not saying there is no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It would be stupid to say that. There are 500,000-600,000 members. So, of course, the Labour Party is part of society. But my experience, very much so, is that anti-Semitism is underrepresented in the Labour Party, as you would expect. And when I see people like Ken Livingstone castigated with these ridiculous allegations of anti-Semitism, it makes me weep. I've had my differences with Ken, for goodness sake, over the years. But he is one of the best anti-racist leaders our movement has ever produced, as Jeremy Corbyn is one of the best anti-racist leaders our movement has ever produced. And it makes me mad when I hear that comrades like this are being accused of anti-Semitism. And I know from both of them how deeply, deeply offended and upset they are by this. But it's got a wider significance beyond their personal feelings, important, by the way, as that is. The aim is quite simply to silence the rest of us. They pick on these people and they silence the rest of us. And to some extent, they are succeeding. But they couldn't have succeeded unless sections of the left and of the Labour movement colluded with this.
But it's diabolically clever, isn't it? If you wish to say that those people who are committed anti-racists are indeed racist, you know, are motivated not by a thirst for justice in a particular sphere of life, but are motivated by hostility or even hatred towards Jewish people, then the facts are irrelevant, because what seems to be happening, Graham, is an offence is fabricated. It's picked up by the media, who say, of course, X, Y, or Z is accused of anti-Semitism. It's multiplied and amplified again, and then he or she is accused of anti-Semitism by huge numbers of people. We never learned what the original crime was. It's covered over. So it seems to me, correct me if you disagree, but I think it's virtually baseless accusations which are simply bruited and magnified and discussed. And when we go to court, so for example, when the UCU, the University College Union, was accused of racism, anti-Semitism, and went to court, even in a bourgeois court, they were able to win because the accusations by John Mann and others were shown to be baseless. But the Labour Party doesn't even seem to rise to the standards of a courtroom.
Oh, I totally agree. I've often said with those who talk about the limitations of bourgeois justice, that very often it's a higher form of justice than what you get in the Labour Party. Yes, essentially, mostly, the allegations of anti-Semitism are without foundation. Now, this has got to be unpicked, because there's some comrades of mine who say, well, in that case, because it's nothing to do with the facts, let's not argue on the facts. And I think that's probably wrong, because however much that is true, when allegations are made which are not true, we still have to correct those inaccuracies. If you don't, then they become given historical record. If Ken Livingstone didn't say, I am not an anti-Semite, then he would, by definition, be admitting that he was an anti-Semite. So we have to correct every record. Let's look at the number of complaints that have been made in the Labour Party, and they amount to an almost insignificant number of people in party. And let me say, for the avoidance of doubt, that one genuine accusation of anti-Semitism, as any other form of racism, is one too many. And I will fight it. I understand what anti-Semitism is. It just makes me sick when the likes of Tom Watson and those kind of people who are making these accusations, trying to be the self-appointed representatives of the court of interrogation, telling me what anti-Semitism is. I think I know what it is. I don't want to exaggerate, by the way, my experience of anti-Semitism. It was important in framing the individual that I am in a political context. But unlike, say, Muslims today and black people today, I have not suffered institutional racism. I'm not separated from power. And racism ultimately is a question of power. So I've suffered prejudice, and I've suffered from ignorant prejudice, and it's hurt me. And I am offended by anti-Semitism, as I am by all forms of racism. But put it in context. The Jewish people in this country as a whole are not an oppressed group in the same sense that black people and Muslims were. They were an oppressed group, and it is possible in the future they will become an oppressed group again. But it is wrong. And it's actually, let me give you some, the things that come into my mind, all these thoughts coming into my mind now. It is that the language of liberation, anti-racist liberation, is being used against the main leaders of the anti-racist movement. And when Margaret Hodge, the dreadful Margaret Hodge, accused Jeremy Corbyn of being a fucking anti-Semite, nothing was done. I was asking, what are we going to do about this? Don't cause trouble. And, you know, we've got a lesson to learn from our political enemies. When Boris Johnson, in the run-up to the last election, was facing political opposition from within his own party, he sacked his political opponents. What did we do? We apologised to our political opponents. I'm not saying that the anti-Semitic witch hunt was the reason Labour lost the election. But I am saying that it was part of the mood music that gave the impression that our leadership was weak, was indecisive, and it was difficult. I understand how hurtful it is when anti-racists like Jeremy are faced with these outrageous allegations, and you want to get away from them, but it doesn't make sense ultimately to do anything but to fight them, and that is what the JVL has had to do. I mean, I really wish the JVL didn't have to exist, but it does, and I'm afraid our work is going to have to be redoubled in the period ahead, or else that voice will become extinct.
Well, we all wish that the need to struggle against terrible crimes didn't exist, but it does. And this is the moment we're alive, as you well know, and we have no choice. But even if we don't win, at least we can stay clean. But look,
it's not only just staying clean, it's laying down a tradition that perhaps future generations can pick up. But I've been saying this all my life. The problem now is a greater sense of urgency because of the climate change crisis. And I've gone on all my life, we must lay down our traditions for future generations. Well, if we're not, it's more difficult than that. If we don't change the situation soon, there won't be future generations to actually lay down those traditions for. And we have this international axis of evil. Trump, Johnson, Netanyahu, Putin, Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, this axis of evil. And for us in Britain, seemed to me the only possible defence against that was the prospect of a Corbyn-led Labour government. Now that has gone, and it's really affected a lot of people. I mean, let's be very clear. This is not just an episodic defeat in the line of ultimate victory. This is a quite important defeat, and it will take a lot of recovery from. But we have no choice but to fight. I mean, immediately in the aftermath of the election defeat, we were all feeling very down. But I said that the only alternative to fighting was to lay down and die. And that's what we have to do.
Well, just across the channel, the Labour under Macron, who's a rascal himself, he has recently, if you're using the litmus test, he has recently said anti-Zionism must be equated with anti-Semitism, but he's also built, he's also got a program of austerity, and he's whipped up a storm. I think Johnson's got a Tory majority of 80, but when you factor in the Labour right, the Lib Dems and the DUP, he's probably got a majority of 200 anyway against the sort of policies that Corbyn stood for. So we have to speak French, do we not? We have to say that even if we don't have a majority representing, articulating our views in Parliament, we still have to fight against what Johnson's planning for us and already carrying out.
Well, clearly the fight now, it's still got to be in the Labour Party, but it never was primarily in Parliament, but even less so now. The only way to recovery is clearly from the grassroots, and to build up from the grassroots back into the Labour Party. Look, we always had a problem with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, because we had this major contradiction between the most left-wing leadership in Labour's history and the relatively low level of class struggle. It meant that when things were going against us, we didn't really have the material base to fight back. And so what we've got to do, and it's very much against the odds, but we've got no choice, is to build up from the grassroots at all levels, on the anti-austerity level, fighting racism, and as part of fighting racism, standing up for the dispossessed throughout the world. And one of those struggles is Palestine, and one of the inner party struggles, but not just inside the Labour Party, is to keep the voice of socialist internationalism in relation to Palestine open. Now,
so is Palestine...
I've just come back. Just before the election started, I went on a tour to Palestine. Not that it changed my mind at all, but it makes you realise that I hadn't been to Palestine for 50 years. And it makes me realise just how right we were. I mean, the daily suffering of the Palestinian people. I I really would like some of those who are trying to shut up that voice to have gone there. It was on a tour organised by ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and it was an eye-opener, and it was a life-changing.
We've had Jeff Halper on for one of the interviews.
Well, I think he's excellent, though.
Oh yeah, doing excellent.
I agree with his essential positions.
Let me yank you back a little bit to the idea. You said that Jews are not oppressed, and by any yardstick, compared to hundreds and hundreds, thousands of dark-skinned people drowning in the Mediterranean, there's no comparison with the position of Jews and the response of this government. But one thing they say is the young black kid who was murdered in London, I forget his name, but it led to changes in the law and definitions of oppression and racism. And the pro-Israel crowd say it's up to Jews to decide if they are being the victims of racism. Therefore, when a pro-Israel gang stands up and says that we are racist, you know, their opinion must be listened to.
Well, two things with that. One, the argument itself is flawed. I mean, there has to be objective evidence. Even under Macpherson, the position was that if an allegation of racism is made, it has to be properly investigated and taken seriously. It doesn't mean to say that there was an act of racism or that the alleged perpetrator was guilty. But the second point, of course, is, well, which Jews? This is itself, I think, an anti-Semitic kind of trope. There is one Jewish voice. Jewish people are offended. Well, other Jewish people are offended by the leaders of the state of Israel speaking in their name. And if it's just a question of offence, then it becomes a nonsense. It becomes something which is evidence-free and just depends on one's perception. So I think that within limits, the whole point of political struggle includes the right to cause offence. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's okay to make racist attacks on people, but it does mean that if someone says, I am offended, that it means that that isn't the end of the subject. You've got to investigate any complaint that is made, but also recognise that there is more than one Jewish voice. In fact, there are more than hundreds of Jewish voices. There are thousands of Jewish voices. I was brought up on the lovely old saying, and I love it, 3 Jews, 4 opinions. Well, you know, 250,000 Jews in this country or whatever. I mean, just think of how many opinions there are. And I agree that the socialist voice within Jewish people in this country, I was going to say the Jewish community, is probably less than it was when I was a boy growing up in the 1950s, certainly less than it was in the 20s and 30s. The Jewish people have a wonderful history in the labour movement. So many early founders of the Communist Party and members of the Labour Party and of the trade unions. But, you know, times has changed. That is no longer the case. And that's fine, but please don't make invisible and silence people like me and the many, many thousands of people like me who are Jewish and socialist, who have been brought up with a different tradition of what being Jewish means.
But isn't that the way, look, in our society, how many people own the same wealth as half the world? It's about a couple of hundred people have the same wealth as 3.5 billion. Inequality is going through the roof in this society. It's extreme. Every doorway on our main city streets has some poor wretch sleeping in it. And you've got a few people like, what's his name, Philip Green and various others who are just, it's a kleptocracy in some areas. You have to have people hate each other in order for that system to continue. And also you have to marginalize critical voices. You know, foreign Jews, rootless cosmopolitans, you know, they're leading the Bolshevik party. Don't trust them, they're foreigners. They're not quite British. This racism in the past against Jews, of course, was sinister, and it's carried over today. So surely this is inevitable. Surely we have to fight it. But it's not radically new. It morphs and changes all the time. But there always have to be scapegoats. Saw a little cartoon recently. The guy with the 50 biscuits on his plate, a working class guy with 1 biscuit on his plate, and an immigrant with an empty plate on the other side of the table. And the guy with the 50 biscuits is warning the guy with the one biscuit, he wants to take that off you. So surely the way our class society is structured, it can only survive by victimizing, marginalizing, and silencing. Your thoughts?
There's something new in this, Mick. Traditionally, that has been the role of the right. Was it Engels or whoever called anti-Semitism the socialism of fools? But
Babel.
there is something new.
The German socialist Babel, yeah.
Yeah, Babel, yeah. There's something that's new here. It's what I said before. It's the way that the language of liberation and anti-racism is being used to defame anti-racists. Me even getting kind of right-wing people talking about, oh, the whites are an oppressed group in this country, which is rubbish. And I mean, with Jews, of course, it's more complicated because there is prejudice. And of course, there's the history of the most appalling oppression of Jewish people in this country, but above all throughout the world. And the Jewish Holocaust was one of the most dreadful events in world history. And it's still only, 75 years old. So I get it. And I also get, it's a very complex, nuanced question. And I've got to use my language very, very carefully here. But I've been at meetings where Jewish members of the Labour Party have felt terrified at what they perceive as left-wing anti-Semitism. And two things have occurred to me. One, it is a fear that is actually genuinely felt amongst a lot of those Jewish comrades. And secondly, at the same time, there is very little, if any, material basis for that fear. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a kind of almost collective hysteria which has material roots, and those material roots are the nightmares of previous generations that are now being manipulated by the right wing. They're manipulated by whether they're Jewish right wing or Zionist right wing or just the right wing, because they found that this is a way to silence anti-racist voices by attacking the anti-racists for being racist themselves. And it's quite nuanced. We've got to understand this isn't just manufactured, or rather it is manufactured by some of the right-wing leaders, but some of the people feeling this. I've had members of my own family, it's unbelievable, but they've said to me that if if Corbyn had won the election, they were going to emigrate to Israel. I mean, it's nonsense. But it was genuinely felt as well. And somehow, I don't quite know how we get through that when there is this kind of collective hysteria that has no material basis. And it can only be a product of that nightmare of previous generations because it is so near. And that's a complex question for us.
So what weight do you attach?
That's why it's so important. We have to still spell out the facts, even though the facts themselves won't be enough.
Sure, but what weight do you attach to, it's an axiom of Zionism that Jews cannot live safely anywhere and must move to a state somewhere and be an impregnable majority, and if necessary, oppress, colonize, and expel others. To what extent do you think the extent to which, I mean, the majority of Jews in Britain, of course, are not Zionists because they don't go to Israel. They've decided that life here is okay. But to what extent does that pernicious doctrine of Zionism allow the views that you've just talked about? Or can those views feed off that assumption that that we're all irredeemably anti-Semitic? Well, we may hide it, but, you know, Jews, Zionists argue that Jews can't live in Europe and should decamp.
Well, of course, that was the fundamental divide that created the Zionist movement towards the end of the 19th century. Until the last World War and the Holocaust, Zionism was still very, very much a minority. And of course, the experience of the Holocaust has greatly encouraged the rise of these kind of false beliefs. But what they're really saying is that people like me have got no place in Britain. Someone who has lived in Britain all my life, my parents, my grandparents, I mean, actually, for what it's of no significance, but let me say it. I mean, my links to this country go back 150 years. And the view of the Zionists and the racists, and often the same people, are saying, well, my place is not in this country. Well, yeah, that is pernicious and it is sinister. My place is in this country if I choose it to be, and I do choose it to be.
You wouldn't have had much in common with Sir Edwin Montague in the Balfour cabinet politically, but he echoed the same thoughts, didn't he? He saw the pernicious doctrine of Zionism and Balfour's efforts and others as aimed at him, and he said he was enjoying life in England, thank you. And anybody who said that his religion had become his nationality and his real future lay in Palestine, he said, of course, you're opening the door to all the anti-Semites to echo that sentiment. So you might not have much in common with Montague, but you share that view, don't you?
I did, and including of course, Balfour himself was an anti-Semite, and he was, I think, introduced the Aliens Act, one of the first acts of racist legislation in this country.
Yeah.
When I see some of the debates at the time in Parliament, it really, really makes you sick. I've heard Zionists, including people who were quite close to me, calling the Palestinians animals. And I said, that's strange. I said, this language brings me back to the views of those who were trying to attack the Jews at the start of the 20th century in the Tory party. It's sinister. And we've got to, if Jews have no right in this country, have no place in this country and throughout Europe, then we are in a very serious place indeed. As if, of course, the Jews are in a safe place in Israel. I mean, you can build walls around you, but you cannot hold back the legitimate voice of a colonized people. And ultimately, that will have to find a solution.
More than a historical footnote, Graham, Balfour, was it Balfour? Yeah, Balfour apparently told the first president of Israel, before he became a president, that Balfour had met in Beirut, if I've got the pronunciation right, with Cosima Wagner, Wagner's widow, who was a vicious anti-Semite, much praised by the Nazis when they came to power. But Balfour said he had met with Cosima Wagner and they had discussed the Jewish question, and they shared views almost completely. So this is even darker than a lot of people imagine about the link, the anti-Semitic impulse towards Zionism.
Well, you can see that, can't you, with Viktor Orban in Hungary, an ally of Netanyahu and a vicious enemy of the Jewish people. And the two are not at all in contradiction. We see it, by the way, with Trump, of course, and even with Johnson. We see this link between pro-Zionist and anti-Semitic. And it's something that I'm only too aware of, yeah.
Well, yeah, if you want Jews to leave Europe, you share that view with anti-Semites.
Well, my place is here, and there are very many of us who feel this very strongly, and that's why we will not be silenced, whatever the pressure. I remember making a speech about 6 months ago, and when Corbyn was still leader, I said, we've got to be careful. We've got to try to maintain our membership of the Labour Party because we're needed to sustain, at that time, the possibility of a radical left Labour government. But I said there is something even more important than being in the Labour Party, and that is to tell the truth, not to be silenced. And if ever the cost of being in the party was to be silenced on the fundamental issues of the day, then we cannot pay that price. And that is, I'm afraid, something we're going to have to face up to today. I'm determined that I will remain a Labour Party member until the day I die, but I will not shut up or be silenced on Palestine or any other issue, certainly not any other anti-racist issue, in order to comply with the diktats of the thought police in the Labour Party and outside.
Graham, let's come back to something really central. We have been talking about it, but if I could just put it this way. The IHRA is the cutting edge of silencing pro-Palestine voices and voices critical of Israel. John Mann gave evidence against the UCU, an industrial tribunal, the judges, they really insulted him hugely. They said of Mann that he said there was a line between legitimate and non-legitimate criticism of Israel, but the judges said Mann didn't try to say where the line was. It seems the line is almost anything, because Gwynedd Council have just been condemned by the Board of Deputies for accusing Israel of war crimes. So if you can't accuse Israel of war crimes, there's not much left that you can say, is there?
There's not much left. I mean, look, let me make my position clear, and I speak here for myself, not for any organisation that I'm part of. As a socialist, internationalist Jew, I don't accept the concept of a Jewish state, or indeed any theocratic state. I can't accept a state which was born by acts of ethnic cleansing. But there are other people who perhaps take us to a two-state solution. Okay, well, that's a matter for legitimate debate. But if I actually was at a training session of the JLM at a Labour Party conference, in which I said, this is my position. Am I in breach of your guidelines? And they couldn't answer, because I'm open about it. It's very difficult for them to attack me for saying I'm a socialist internationalist Jew. I don't accept the concept of a Jewish state. What I think is that Israel-Palestine should be a state of its citizens like any other democratic country. And I think that is my position. So if they want to get me for that, well, let them do it. But I agree, there are people who actually do accept the concept of a Jewish state, but can still criticize Israel. And even they will be excluded under this definition.
But look, if anti-Semitism and even remembering the Holocaust, the industrial extermination of Jews, Roma, 3 million Poles and so on, the killing of those numbers, if it's perverted by the likes of Netanyahu, who tried notoriously to blame a Palestinian collaborator with Hitler, but he tried to say Hitler was not really hot on the issue. It was a Palestinian who kind of persuaded him to do it. When you get that kind of weaponizing of the Holocaust, either to attack Palestinians or to attack people like you and me, surely that's very dangerous for Jews.
It is very dangerous. I am worried. I think a lot of us in JVL are worried that if you weaponize anti-Semitism, and let's be clear, that is being done by some people, you're playing with fire. And I think, wrongly, by the way, that some people may begin to feel a resentment towards Jewish people. And this is the trouble when you present Jewish people as having one voice. There are, as I say, thousands of different voices. We, like every people, are a diverse people. So yes, it's dangerous, and I worry, especially in the growing climate of a move to the right internationally.
Well, I think Finkelstein, but other people have made that, Norman Finkelstein have made the point that if the Jewish community is pushed, in inverted commas, if the so-called Jewish community is pushed to the front of the right-wing attack and the defeat of Corbyn, of the hope that Corbyn could reduce homelessness in the streets, could end austerity, could bring in some kind of form of social justice. If Jews are seen to be spearheading that attack wrongly and falsely, then there will be anti-Semitism. It's going to grow anti-Semitism as night follows day. Then people will be ignorant, but they'll feel justified.
Absolutely. And the JVL will fight that manifestation of anti-Semitism, as we do every form of anti-Semitism, as we do every form of racism. And our task in the JVL and across the left is to build a real alliance at the base against all forms of racism, not to exceptionalize anti-Semitism, but to see it as the fight against it as part of a general anti-racist struggle. And that's our task.
So what we got here, we got your comrade being barred from speaking tomorrow about the Holocaust in a way that he sees as fitting. We've got Palestinian voices being silenced by accusations that even to criticize the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. How can we see Israel and Palestine, therefore, being some kind of a litmus test for progressive politics? So let me look at North America. Black Lives Matter. They know that the cops who are killing black people in significant numbers in the USA are often trained in Israel. And they have adopted the issue of Palestine to a central tenet of their fight against racism. Here in Britain, Stand Up to Racism in Glasgow and elsewhere has avoided that like the plague. And they have said, hey, we don't take a position on Palestine and we're going to fight racism. Surely that's completely untenable, Graham.
It is completely untenable. Our fight is indivisible. And as I said before, our fight is to tell the truth. Now, sometimes it's not easy to tell the truth, but we've got no choice. It's too easy to avoid these difficult issues. And yes, is it a litmus test? I'm afraid it's becoming more and more of a litmus test.
Graham, make some concluding remarks for the viewers. Over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Sorry, people outside making a racket here. We've got a local left gathering. Well, we're now in a key moment, not only in Britain, but in the world. We're going through hard times, and this is where we will show our mettle. We've mourned what happened on December the 12th, and now's the time to organise. We have to fight back, we've got to learn the lessons, and we've got to, in a period of defeat, begin a political differentiation, not unnecessarily minoritising ourselves, putting ourselves on the margins, but having to come to difficult decisions, having to speak truth to power, however difficult it is. And if the cost of that means that we have to be alone at times, then so be it. I don't want us to be alone. I want to be millions fighting against oppression. But perhaps in the short run, we will be forced to lose some of our erstwhile allies. It's not what I want. But if the cost of gaining favour is to collude with that which is wrong and to be silent, then I won't, and many others won't. And I know the JVL and the other organisations with which I'm connected will not either. I'm a member of the Labour Representation Committee. I'm on the editorial board of Labour Briefing. And I know that these organisations and publications will link up with others in the fight that we have to face in the years ahead. There's no choice but to fight. The alternative is just to lay down and die.
Graham Bash, long-term supporter of Palestine, long-term left-wing socialist, fighting it, sometimes a lonely fight, I'm sure, inside the Labour Party. And yes, we agree, grim times ahead. But inside and outside, we'll join together because our enemies join together to oppose us. Graham Bash, thanks very much for appearing.
Thank you very much indeed.
This conversation.
Thank you.
Friends, there's a couple of announcements. Today, what's today's date? Graham, tell me today's date, will you?
Oh, God, I don't know.
Sunday the 26th.
26th.
11 years ago, the BBC refused to broadcast the humanitarian appeal for Gaza by the Disasters Emergency Committee. They said it was to preserve the balance and the reputation for balance of the state broadcasting corporation in this country. Friends, that's how debased and degenerate the BBC can become. And during the recent struggle, before the election, they threw everything they possibly could at the left-wing challenger and gave every possible alibi to a rascal, a slug like Johnson. So we have to make our own media to an extent. Graham's editor of Labour Briefing. They publish, they distribute. We publish, we distribute as well in different media. But we need your help. So this interview will be available in a couple of minutes on the national page of Scottish PSC. Please share it, please like it, and please help us to build, because you have to get, if you're a keyboard warrior, that's okay, but you have to get away from the keyboard sometimes, meet together and plan. Scotland are playing Israel in Glasgow on the 26th of March. And we wish to give them the welcome that they deserve and support the Palestinian appeal for boycott, divestment and sanctions. If you want to help, if you not only bleed for the Palestinians, but you actually want to make a practical difference, then we ask you to join Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I never mentioned it in the conversation with Graham, but I was with 4 other people on trial for racism, for hating Jews, for saying the words "end the siege of Gaza," genocide in Gaza. I was on trial then in Glasgow for 3 years for daring to criticise the bloodshed by the Israeli army during Operation Protective Edge. And that was deemed to be anti-Semitic because apparently in court, we did not really care about the blood of Palestinians, 2,200 dead. It was a sly allusion to an anti-Semitic medieval blood libel. And that was fought out, and we won, of course, in a Glasgow Sheriff Court. So we have to fight. They're coming for us. Even if they're not, we have to fight. So thanks again, Graham Bash, for joining us. Thanks every viewer for joining us. Please share to the limit of your ability, and please get in touch if you want to make a difference. Thank you. Bye.